In January 2026, the CEO of the largest automaker in Europe stood in front of reporters and said something that should have made headlines in every newsroom in America. He said Volkswagen will not build an Audi factory in the United States. The plan is dead. The reason? Tariffs. The very tariffs that were supposed to bring manufacturing back to America just pushed one of the biggest car companies on earth in the opposite direction. And here is the part that makes this story extraordinary. While Volkswagen was walking away from the United States, it was simultaneously pouring $7 billion into a Gigafactory in Canada. Not a small investment, not a pilot project. The largest battery cell factory Volkswagen has ever built anywhere in the world. Bigger than its European plants, bigger than anything it has in Asia. The single largest industrial investment in Canadian history. Being built right now, as you watch this, in a small town in Ontario called St. Thomas, population 43,000. The foundations are being poured, the contracts are signed, the hiring has begun, 3,000 direct jobs, 30,000 indirect jobs, 90 gigawatt hours of annual battery production, enough to power 1 million electric vehicles per year, and the batteries produced in this Canadian factory will be shipped across the border to supply Volkswagen's assembly plants in the United States. Let that sink in for a moment. The tariffs were designed to force companies to build inside America. Instead, one of the world's largest automakers is building its most important factory just across the border, in a country that the administration has repeatedly threatened, insulted, and tried to pressure into submission. This is not what the policy was supposed to produce. And to understand why it happened, you have to follow the money. But first, you need to understand the scale of what is happening to the global auto industry right now, because Volkswagen is not an isolated case. It is the clearest example of a pattern that is reshaping the entire manufacturing map of North America. In 2025, GM announced it would halt production of the Bright Drop electric delivery van at its plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, cutting 1,200 jobs. But that was not because Canada was uncompetitive. It was because sales were slow across the board. At the same time, Stellantis moved planned Jeep Compass production from its Brampton plant in Ontario to an idled facility in Illinois, part of a $13 billion plan to expand American manufacturing capacity. On the surface, that looks like the tariff policy working, but look deeper and the picture reverses. Stellantis is now paying more to produce in the United States than it would have in Canada because American costs, labor, energy, materials, are higher, and the tariff savings only offset part of that difference. Ford's electric vehicle unit is projected to lose over $4 billion in 2026. Not because the vehicles are bad, because the cost structure of manufacturing in America, combined with the tariff regime that was supposed to help American industry, has made the economics nearly impossible. The tariffs add cost to imported components. The components are expensive because the supply chains were built over decades to be global, not national, and rebuilding those supply chains domestically takes years and billions of dollars that companies are spending on tariff payments instead of factory construction. This is the paradox at the center of the entire policy. And Volkswagen's CEO put it into a single sentence. Volkswagen's CEO Oliver Blume told the German newspaper Handelsblatt that tariffs on European automakers cost his company $2.5 billion in just the first 9 months of 2025, $2.5 billion. That is not a rounding error. That is more than many companies earn in a year. And that number fundamentally changed the economics of building a new factory in America. Bloom was direct. He said, given an unchanged tariff burden, large additional investment cannot be funded. That single sentence captures the entire paradox of the current trade policy. The tariffs were supposed to attract investment. Instead, they are so expensive that companies cannot afford to invest even if they wanted to. Building a factory costs billions of dollars. If you are already hemorrhaging billions in tariff payments, there is no capital left for construction. The money that would have gone into American jobs, American concrete, American steel, that money went to tariff payments instead. And it is not just Volkswagen. BMW and Mercedes-Benz both assemble SUVs in the United States, but they still import components from Europe that now carry massive duties. The entire European auto industry paid an estimated $5 to $6 billion in tariffs to the United States in 2025. That is $5 to $6 billion that did not go into new factories, new jobs, or new technology. It went into government revenue. And the American consumer paid for it on the other end, in higher car prices, reduced model choices, and longer wait times for vehicles that used to be available immediately. The average price of a new car in the United States has risen to over $50,000. Part of that increase is directly attributable to the tariff burden being passed through the supply chain. Every imported component, every overseas-made part, every battery cell that crosses a tariff wall adds cost. And that cost does not disappear. It gets embedded in the sticker price. American families are paying the tariff every time they walk into a dealership. They just do not see the word tariff on the receipt. And so, Volkswagen made a different calculation. It looked at the map, it looked at the costs, and it chose Canada. Here is why the math works. Canada has something the United States does not offer at the same scale: clean, cheap, abundant electricity. The province of Ontario, where the Gigafactory is being built, generates most of its power from nuclear and hydroelectric sources. The electricity rate for industrial users in Ontario is among the lowest in North America, and it is green. That means the batteries produced at this factory will be manufactured with carbon dioxide-free energy, a requirement that is becoming essential for selling electric vehicles in Europe, where carbon border adjustment mechanisms and strict emissions regulations mean that the carbon footprint of every component matters. A battery made with coal-fired electricity is worth less in the European market than an identical battery made with nuclear power. This is not a moral distinction. It is a financial one. European regulations literally penalize high-carbon manufacturing. The United States, by contrast, still generates a significant portion of its electricity from natural gas and coal. A battery factory in Tennessee or South Carolina would produce the same cells, but with a higher carbon footprint, making those cells less competitive in global markets that increasingly penalize emissions in dollars, not just rhetoric. Canada also has direct access to the critical minerals that go into batteries: lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite. Canada has deposits of all of them within its borders. Ontario alone sits on some of the richest nickel and cobalt deposits in the world. The country has been building an entire battery supply chain from mine to cell to vehicle, and Volkswagen's Gigafactory is the centerpiece of that strategy. The goal is vertical integration on Canadian soil, raw materials extracted domestically, processed domestically, manufactured into battery cells domestically, and then shipped to assembly plants across North America. No dependency on China for processing, no vulnerability to shipping disruptions, no exposure to the geopolitical risks that have made global supply chains so fragile over the past 5 years. But the most important advantage is trade access. Under CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, goods manufactured in Canada that meet the rules of origin can enter the United States with preferential tariff treatment. That means batteries built in Ontario can be shipped to Volkswagen's American assembly plants without facing the same tariff walls that are blocking imports from Europe. Canada becomes the back door. A factory in Canada gives Volkswagen North American production, which satisfies the demand for local manufacturing, without the tariff burden that makes American production uneconomical. And this is not just a Volkswagen story. This is a pattern. While Volkswagen was canceling its Audi plant and doubling down on Canada, other manufacturers were making similar calculations. In early February 2026, Germany's Economic Affairs Minister visited Ottawa and told reporters that Germany's car industry is willing to invest in Canada and is in talks to extend its footprint there. South Korea signed a memorandum of understanding with Canada to develop manufacturing for Kia and Hyundai. Stellantis, which had moved some production from its Canadian plant to Illinois as part of a deal to expand American operations, found itself caught in the same tariff trap, paying more to produce in the United States than it saved by being inside the tariff wall. The irony is relentless. The policy designed to make America the center of global manufacturing is making its closest neighbor the center instead. And the numbers tell the story. Canada has attracted over $20 billion in battery and electric vehicle investment in the past 3 years. The Volkswagen Gigafactory alone represents $7 billion. There are additional plants being built or planned by Stellantis and LG Energy Solutions in Windsor, a facility worth up to $15 billion in combined investment and tax incentives. Umicore is building a battery components factory in Eastern Ontario with nearly $1 billion in government support. Multiple firms are setting up operations in Bécancour, Quebec, which is rapidly becoming a battery materials hub. Honda announced a major EV manufacturing investment in Ontario, and the pipeline keeps growing. Canada is building an end-to-end battery supply chain, from the mine to the cell to the vehicle, that did not exist 5 years ago. The transformation is happening so fast that industry analysts are now describing Ontario as the emerging Detroit of the electric vehicle era. And the accelerant for all of it is American trade policy. Every tariff increase makes Canada more attractive. Every threat of new duties makes the case for investing north of the border stronger. And every company that moves investment from the United States to Canada proves that the policy is producing the opposite of its intended effect. Now, the question everyone should be asking is, can this last? Because there is a massive risk embedded in this entire strategy, a risk that no one building these factories can fully control. The CUSMA trade agreement, the same agreement that makes Canadian manufacturing attractive, is scheduled for its mandatory 6-year review on July 1st, 2026. Less than 5 months away. All 3 countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, must agree to extend the agreement for another 16 years. If any country declines, the agreement enters annual reviews until it expires in 2036. And if any country withdraws entirely, 6 months' notice is all that is required. The United States ambassador to Canada has already signaled that the review will be aggressive. He has called the process long and grinding. He has said American businesses will submit comments that are not going to be positive, and he has suggested linking unrelated issues, like military procurement, to the trade negotiations. If the United States decides to tighten the rules of origin, raise tariffs on Canadian goods, or withdraw from the agreement entirely, every factory that was built on the assumption of tariff-free cross-border access could suddenly face the same walls that blocked investment in the first place. Volkswagen is betting $7 billion on the assumption that CUSMA will survive, that cross-border trade will continue, that batteries built in Ontario will still be able to reach assembly plants in Tennessee and South Carolina without prohibitive duties. It is not alone in making that bet. Every battery plant, every auto parts supplier, every logistics company that has invested in cross-border manufacturing capacity over the past 3 years is making the same bet. $20 billion in Canadian battery and EV investment rides on the assumption that the trade agreement holds. If that assumption holds, Canada wins. It becomes the battery manufacturing capital of North America, powered by clean energy, fueled by critical minerals, and connected to the American market by trade agreements that give it an advantage no tariff can replicate. Ontario alone would host enough battery production capacity to supply a significant portion of the entire North American electric vehicle market. St. Thomas, a town of 43,000 people, would become one of the most important nodes in the global EV supply chain. If that assumption breaks, if CUSMA collapses or is gutted during the review, Canada faces a crisis of its own. Billions in stranded investment. Thousands of jobs dependent on a trade relationship that no longer functions. A supply chain built for integration in a world that has chosen fragmentation. And Volkswagen would face the nightmare scenario, a $7 billion factory producing batteries that cannot reach their intended customers without paying the same tariffs that made building in America unaffordable in the first place. The entire investment thesis would collapse overnight, and Volkswagen faces the same question every global manufacturer is facing right now. Where do you build when the rules change every year, when tariffs shift every quarter? When the country that wants your factories also charges you billions to operate there? The old model, build where costs are lowest, ship where demand is highest, is dead. The new model is build where the trade rules are most stable. And right now, for a growing number of the world's largest companies, that place is not the United States. It is the country next door. The German Economic Affairs Minister said it directly during his visit to Ottawa. Germany's car industry is willing to invest here. That sentence would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Canada was never a major destination for automotive investment. It was a supporting player, supplying parts, assembling some vehicles, but never the center of gravity. That is changing. And the force driving the change is not Canadian policy alone. It is the combination of Canadian advantages and American self-inflicted barriers. Consider the historical parallel. In the early 20th century, the American auto industry was born in Detroit because that city offered the perfect combination of raw materials, cheap energy, skilled labor, and access to markets. Steel from the Great Lakes, cheap electricity from nearby power plants, workers who had been trained in the machine shops and foundries of the Midwest, and rail and water connections that could move finished vehicles to every corner of the continent. A century later, St. Thomas, Ontario offers a strikingly similar combination for the electric vehicle era. Critical minerals from Canadian mines, clean nuclear and hydroelectricity at industrial rates, a skilled manufacturing workforce trained by decades of auto industry presence in the region, and direct road and rail access to the American market through trade agreements that eliminate tariff barriers. The geography has not changed. The Great Lakes are still there. The border is still there. The economic logic is still there. What has changed is the policy environment on the American side of that border. And that change is redirecting the flow of capital northward. This is bigger than one factory. This is bigger than one company. This is a structural shift in how global manufacturers think about North America. The old question was, do we build in the United States or in China? The new question is, do we build in the United States or next to the United States? And for a growing number of the world's largest industrial companies, the answer is next to, in Canada, in Mexico, in places where the costs are lower, the energy is cleaner, the trade agreements are intact, and the rules do not change every quarter based on the political mood in Washington. The tariffs are not bringing manufacturing home, they are pushing it just far enough away that companies can avoid the cost while staying close enough to serve the market, across the border, around the tariff wall. Into the country that America's own trade agreement makes the most logical destination for exactly this kind of investment. Whether this represents a temporary arbitrage or a permanent shift depends entirely on what happens in the next 5 months. The CUSMA review will determine the future of North American manufacturing, and the decisions being made in Washington right now will determine whether America's closest ally becomes its greatest industrial competitor, not through aggression, but through the simple, relentless logic of economics. To stay ahead of these shifts and understand what they mean for the global economy, make sure you are following this channel. because the factory is already being built, and the map of global manufacturing is being redrawn in real time.